Bonsoir, good afternoon. Well, first of all, I'd like to introduce this panel on money, politics and political parties in the United States in 2019, or I should say 2020, because that's the most interesting point. First of all, the participants to my left is Caroline Fredrickson. She is the President Emerita of the American Constitution Society. She is the author of 2 essays, one under the bus on women in the labor market and various forms of discrimination that women suffer from in the labor market. She also worked for the Clinton administration and worked with 2 senators in the U.S. Senate. And she also wrote a recent essay more on the state of American politics. So it must be a very sad read. I did get through it, and it's a fascinating book, but it is a pretty sad read. Caroline is presently teaching as a visiting professor at a place which I'm vaguely familiar with, which is Sciences Po Lyon, and she will be returning to Washington in the fall to comment on the impeachment and other activities. And I should say Caroline, by training, is a lawyer. To my left is my friend, Caroline is also a dear friend, but my dear friend Ray LaRaja from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Ray is one of the best specialists with our master, Bruce Kane, of money and politics in the United States. He also wrote extensively on political parties and is often quoted in the New York Times or the Washington Post. I should say that also I forgot to mention that Caroline has a long piece in Libération this morning. So if you go to the website or the paper, you'll find all of what Caroline will tell us this afternoon, so you can skip the conference and go directly to the bar for aperitif. The idea in bringing those 2 scholars together who have both have a similar perspective on American politics, which is one of real scholars and yet at the same time practitioners. Caroline was very much involved in the recent Supreme Court appointment and how the progressives in the United States fought that appointment. Unfortunately, we all know the result. Ray not only is a scholar, but is also very much involved in polling. So he'll tell us how Americans poll on the issue of the election right now, and also often works with the Brookings Institution. So we have more than just 2 scholars, but we also have practitioners of American politics, think tankers, and people who have been involved in government. And we're very, very privileged for them coming all this way this evening. Just to give you an idea of how we're going to proceed, first of all, I would like both of them, and I asked both of them to give us a few introductory remarks on the state of the money game in American politics. Then we'll look at a couple of precise cases. I'm sure you are all interested in this bizarre evolution of small donors being dominant in the Trump campaign right now. The up to 70% of the money that Donald Trump has collected so far comes from small donors who have given the campaign less than $200, which is an interesting evolution and counterintuitive if you can think about it. I would like them also to address the pledge that Elizabeth Warren has repeated of getting off the money addiction by refusing large donations, whether she's going to hold on to that pledge. Okay, all right. Well, we have the answer to the question already. And then I asked both of them because this conversation this afternoon will be in English, but both Caroline and Ray understand French very well, speak it very well too, and they know France very well. So I asked them to kind of give us their feeling as to what is happening in American politics that is going to be transferred, or that might be transferred, or that we should not transfer to French politics. This morning we were talking with Ray about the fact that there was an unmitigated catastrophe in transferring a political process from the U.S. to France, and that's France adopting a system of primaries to choose its presidential candidates. And we know that this was an industrial catastrophe of major proportions, which led to a collapse of the French party system. So we will be more interested in the money problem and the financing of elections, but I think that the comparative dimension is both essential in the context, but also in the more institutional context of Institut des Amériques. I would be remiss if I didn't say that the American embassy in France contributed to bringing Ray to this land. You are now an official guest of Donald Trump. But, you know, well, now you know. It's always time for you to leave. But what I'm saying is, like, sometimes good things happen, and they should be noted. And another way to put it is, politics doesn't extend its ugly hand all the way to Institut des Amériques. So we're grateful for them for this support. And so let's just get started. Caroline, what's happening in the campaign right now? What is it that you would identify as the really important points in that money, politics, and political parties conversation?
Well, thanks, Vincent, and thanks to the Institut des Amériques for holding this conference, for inviting me, and for having this discussion. I'm really very pleased to be here. I thought maybe it would be helpful, because as Vincent said, I am by training a lawyer, and I've worked in constitutional law, but I've also spent a long time in politics. I worked in the White House in the Clinton administration, and I worked for the Democratic leader in the Senate, and was chief of staff to a senator, another senator from Washington State. Actually have been deeply involved in the political process, including raising money for candidates. One of the senators I worked for when I was chief of staff, actually one of the few professional staff members who are allowed to participate in fundraising. There's supposed to be a separation between the professional staff and the fundraising staff, but the chief of staff is one of the few people who can do both of those things. So I actually participated in calling people and asking them to give money to the senator I worked for, and I had an opportunity to really have a direct experience of how the fundraising happens and how it influences members of Congress, elected officials in a very direct and personal way. So I thought maybe I'd start with a little bit of that and then talk for a very short period of time about the legal framework around campaign finance in the United States, because I think people may have some understanding of it, but I think it's helpful to understand where things are. So just by way of personal background, what I have had the experience of living through working in politics is the close coordination between the campaign financing and the issue lobbying that happens. This is obviously not surprising to anyone, I think, that lobbying on the Hill is done by people who also give money to politicians. They come for meetings, and I'll use the example of the aviation industry, for example. You might have Boeing come in for a meeting and to talk about trade policy, maybe to talk about Airbus, for example. And then later that evening, there'll be a dinner hosted by the aviation industry for a senator, and they give lots of money. Those things are supposed to be separate, and yet, of course, for the senator, that's all in the same day. It's hard to distinguish between whether that was a directly giving money so that the senator does exactly what the industry wants on that policy, or whether there's a separation. The influence is so strong and so regular that even outside of the direct campaign contributions, political officials are deeply influenced by money in every single day on the issues that they work on. It's a deep part of the way that politics happens in Washington. So a quick background on the legal framework. One of the more well-known decisions by the Supreme Court in the last decade is known as Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. This is a decision that is widely hated on the left because what it did, in a very short form way of stating it, is allowed corporations to give money to candidates. But I would actually say that I think it's a misunderstanding, really, to think that Citizens United was the big, terrible decision. Which is not to say I think it was a good decision. I just think there are worse ones. There are even worse ones. And the decision that came subsequently, which is known as Free Speech Now, is the decision that opened the doors to independent expenditures. And I think this is the area of American politics and money in politics that people, most Americans even, but certainly observers from afar, are less aware of. The money that doesn't go directly to a campaign, but the money that is around the campaign, the funding by billionaires, by multimillionaires, by corporations, that is, in theory, not allowed to be coordinated with a campaign, but can be supporting a candidate. This money is very hard to track, and Ray, I think, can go into much greater detail, certainly, than I can about trying to understand the volume of money in these independent expenditures. But the direct giving of money to candidates is better tracked and better understood than this dark money, we call it, of independent expenditures that is allowed unlimited amounts of money that can go into advertising, that can go into grassroots mobilization, that can go into all sorts of campaign activities that we don't really understand. Those are the decisions of our Supreme Court and lower courts that have just opened the door to extraordinary amounts of money. And just one last piece, and maybe we can talk more about this, but I think one of the other things that is very important for 2020, and that again is much less obvious to people, including Americans, than the presidential race. Of course, we're all pretty focused on that because, well, certainly the people I know are very hoping for a change in 2020. I think many people in the world are hoping for a change in 2020. But there's also something called redistricting that happens. We have our upcoming census, happens every 10 years, as required by the United States Constitution. After the census, our state legislatures go through a process of creating districts for congressional seats as well as state legislative seats. That will determine for the next 10 years who controls Congress? And it's extraordinarily important. And there is a lot of money that is going in to influence those races as well, because who controls the state legislatures will also determine who controls Congress in the future, because they control redistricting. You know, I'd love to talk a little bit about 2010 and the role of the Republicans played in controlling redistricting then, but I could talk all day about that, so I will turn it back to you, Vincent.
But there is an important point here which we'll address a little bit later on, which is that this importance of money also in local races and in the states has led to also experiments. In a way, the states are much more creative in regulating money in politics than the federal government can be for national elections. So that's also a point that we'll bring into the conversation at a later point.
Great. Thanks, Vincent. And thank you to the Institut des Amériques for inviting me, and of course, Donald Trump's embassy. So, you know, we live in a time of weakening democracy, of legitimacy for parties and politicians, and the way we finance politics doesn't help. And yet, you know, political spending does have a legitimate purpose to inform and to mobilize voters. And so how do we balance this democratic imperative with principles of anti-corruption and political equality? It's a challenge throughout every democracy. Some countries do it better than others, and I'll talk about the possibly worst-case scenario, the United States. The system not only gives greater influence to the wealthy, but it also increases the polarization of the party system. You know, the U.S. is truly the Wild West of political spending. The most recent legislative election for the United States Congress was $5.2 billion. That is the equivalent of about 20 euros per voter. In the 2016 presidential election, the top two candidates, Clinton and Trump, spent $2.4 billion. Now, Clinton lost her election. By the way, she spent 50% more than Trump. He benefited a lot from free media. He's a master at attracting media, as you know. In France, by comparison, I'm just using France. I would try to use other countries, but we're here, so I'll use France. Macron, Le Pen, they had legal limits on spending, and over 2 rounds they spent roughly 60 million euros. That's roughly 2 euros per voter. So in the U.S. it was 16.5 euros per voter. So the two presidential candidates in the U.S. spent more than 8 times as much, just by way of comparison. So the French might complain they have problems with money in politics, but you have it good. So why is there so much money in U.S. politics? Well, I think Caroline alluded to some of these reasons. First, there are no limits because of these Supreme Court decisions on spending like in France. In the U.S., there's an absolutism towards free speech and campaign spending. The U.S. Supreme Court has basically equated it, the spending of money, with free speech, and they don't allow them. And it's not just recently. This goes back to cases to the 70s. Second, in the U.S., we have very long elections. Fundraising begins right after the last election, and that's for Congress and for the presidency. And so they start raising money from wealthy donors in a process called the invisible primary. We've already gone through this. And those invisible primaries, sometimes they're called the Wall Street primary or the Beverly Hill primary for the Democrats who go to Hollywood. So these are kind of things that happen before the primary. Third thing that affects is the cost of advertising. Television advertising in the United States is the single biggest expense for these campaigns. Now, this might change with the internet. That could be a very good thing, but 60% of spending in the presidential election is for that. And in France, we know such advertising is banned. Fourth, the parties are pretty weak in the U.S. Why? Because the U.S., we campaign, we market a personality, not necessarily a party. So every election, there's a new personality to market. And this dynamic, I think, is happening in France. It's happening in some other countries as well, certainly in Latin America. The personality-driven campaigns inspire this rise of political consultants. And consultants, they encourage these long, expensive campaigns. They make money off them. And so, again, by comparison, you see shorter campaigns in France, better news media coverage, I might add, and a willingness to restrict spending. Nonetheless, I see three trends, and we can talk about this later, that are making costs go up in France, I think. The personalization of politics, this Macronisme is an example. The use of primaries, you're just adding another election. And then third, the proliferation of mini parties. And we see this, and this is kind of akin to what we see in the United States with these super PACs, but certainly at lower amounts of money. Let me say a few words, because Caroline alluded to this about the political organizations, about who gives money. A lot of the focus is on corporations. Yes, they spend money, very important. I think, based on some research I've done, I think really where the corporations spend their money wisely is in agenda setting, in terms of how they spend money on think tanks and lobbying. And yes, this is just part of the package. But what's really changed over the last 30 years is the increase in donations from individual citizens. It's grown immensely. And just for simplicity, there are three kinds of individuals. At the top tier are the super, super wealthy. The people like, some of you may have heard of the Koch brothers, David and Charles Koch, who is industrial magnates. They set up parallel party structures. They give millions to political organizations, some of them called, they're super PACs. We have all these different names. It's so non-transparent. They spend millions to influence elections, often more than the candidates and parties themselves. Then there's the merely wealthy, the millionaires. And they give thousands of dollars to many different committees all over, to both politicians and parties. Finally, there's this new tier that's growing rapidly, small donors. And they give amounts anywhere from $5 to $200, mostly on the internet. And in a sense, this is a very good development. You know, they could probably offset the power of these big donors. But this group is not your average American. These are professionals. They're not members of the working class or even the middle class in most respects. There's one other side to individual giving that I want to point out. All of these donors tend to be ideologically extreme, at least by American standards. Small donors are no exception, and they're populist. So many people gave money to Bernie Sanders, a populist social democrat. But Donald Trump, as Vincent suggested, he's received more money from small donors than anyone in history, including Obama, who's pretty good at this as well. 240 million from small donors, okay? He raised more than Sanders and Clinton combined in 2016. And he's on record to do it again. So here are some trends. I'll finish with these things I see for 2020 in the US elections. All the presidential candidates are going to try to get these small donors. In fact, the Democrats have made it, they must do it in a certain sense. You have no choice. To be eligible to participate in the primary debates, you have to have a minimum number of small donors. And the candidates who are best positioned for this are the ones who have the best name recognition and who are very savvy with social media. It's not necessarily the people who are the most experienced in government or the best ideas. And I've heard this expression used by some people in Washington. They call it the tyranny of small donors. Why is that? Because they feel like candidates are taking positions sometimes that might hurt them, that are extreme by rank and file standards in order to win the primary, because they need the small donors, okay? One more thing is that Trump is doing phenomenally well with small donors. In the last 3 months, he's raised $45 million. Again, some of these people have never given money before. None of the candidates, including Warren or Sanders, have come close to that, although they're doing pretty well. Finally, super PACs, these organizations that have no spending limits, they're going to have a large role. And most Americans don't know who they are. They have these innocuously sounding names like Americans for a Better America. No one knows who they are. Every candidate, including Warren, she might deny this, but if she wins the nomination, there are going to be a lot of super PACs supporting her. She'll deny them. These are not my children, she'll say, but they're going to be helping her. I'm sure of it. So at the end of the day, money is not the most important factor in winning in the U.S., but we know in the last election, the Democrats lost the presidency by a few votes in places like Wisconsin. And if Clinton perhaps spent a little more money mobilizing people in Milwaukee of all places, the Democrats might have won. So it's not like, it is important. So let me stop there. Vincent, I know you had some questions.
Well, let's remain on the topic of small donors. You spoke of the tyranny of small donors, and what would be the offset to that? I mean, because, for example, Thomas Edsall, in a recent article that I shared with you, says, well, there's also a great danger on the Democratic side because you see classes of donors such as the knowledge professionals giving more and more to the Democratic Party in the tech industry too, among doctors, the percentage of those professionals giving to the Democratic Party rather than to the Republican Party is steadily increasing, and especially in terms of generations. The younger they are, the more Democratic leaning they are. And this has consequences in terms of the agenda and the contradictions between the policies that, for example, Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders might be advocating, and the policies that are pushed by those mega donors or second-tier donors, as you described them. So how does that offset the tyranny of the small donors? And is it like a game in which political candidates on either side are basically prisoners or hostages? And is there a way of liberating yourself as a candidate from that tyranny?
Well, you know, it's a hard question. I'd say it made me go back to my first book about labor policy, Under the Bus. Is one of the issues that I look at, which I know David Bensman, who's coming tomorrow to speak, has spent some time looking at, is the kind of the dismantling of labor protections through the creation of kind of contracting, the Uber form, Airbnb, that these tech companies say they're only platforms, they're not employing people. And this has had a deep influence on Democratic politics because the tech industry is so interested in pushing for labor policies that don't recognize Uber drivers as employees, but say that they're contractors. They are all small business owners, and their business is to drive a car. And Uber is just an app. You have it on your phone. It's just an app, but it's not an employer. One of the reasons that issue has been so hard to resolve in the United States is because the tech industry is such a large player in making campaign donations to Democrats that they have not been able to see what I think is a fairly obvious labor policy analysis, which is that clearly these are employers, and that the way of analyzing an employment relationship would include these kinds of drivers as employees. But it has really muddied the water for Democrats and created a division between their traditional supporters in the labor movement and the tech supporters. And it's not just the Hollywood primary, it's the Silicon Valley primary, I think, much more than it is the Hollywood primary for Democrats. So I think this is an issue that I think Thomas Edsall was right to identify. I saw it when I worked on the Hill already, you know, in the 90s and in the early 2000s. You know, the Facebooks and Microsofts and Googles and others that have a large role in policy, but also in politics now, in setting up and providing campaign contributions. And we have a radically shrinking labor movement, which may represent a lot more people, but has much less political influence. And so for me, as somebody on the liberal side of the spectrum, I see this as dangerous for the Democratic Party to be so identified with these kinds of interests. It definitely has had an impact on policymaking. As I said, it's one of the reasons why we've had such a hard time. The Democratic Party has had a hard time. You see a lot of President Obama's former staff people who have gone to have very high positions at Uber, at Facebook, at Airbnb and the others. That kind of mingling of political operatives from the Democratic side and the tech industry, I think, has created a kind of a problem, sort of identity crisis in many ways for the Democrats. So I don't know if I can speak to the small donor tyranny, because it's not an experience I have seen so much. I do actually want to say that you alluded to the state level reforms. One of the state level reforms that's most popular is to actually allow for more small donor contributions by providing an incentive, by matching, having the state government provide a match for the donation made under a certain level by an individual. And the idea is to bring more people into the process rather than having just super wealthy people give contributions, so that politicians don't only identify with the issues that, say, in my experience, the lobbyists would bring in to talk to a senator about, but actually start hearing from the people who work at the local laundromat and what they care about. So I don't know if it seems to me like an exaggeration to call it the tyranny of the small donor. That may be just in this very narrow frame that we're in. It seems to me that there's a positive reform to enable more small donors, but a broader, moving out from the very highly ideological upper middle class or sort of wealthy people who are the small donors now, and expanding the small donor group to include people from a much broader swath of society.
And don't you think that, and then this is also a question that goes to you, Ray, but don't you think that tyranny of small donors is all the more important at this stage of the campaign, which is in the primary stage, because it also serves as an indicator of how popular or appealing or attractive a candidate may be. It's more about the significance of a candidate being able to raise large amounts of money through small donors than the money that is actually raised. It's more like a form of thermometer or a gauge of the candidate's popularity. So I would kind of dispute the term of tyranny of small donors in the general election, but I think in the primary it might be a more salient point.
Well, just one quick thing to add to that, and maybe Ray will tell me that I completely don't understand this issue, since he's much more of an expert than I am. I wonder, though, if this is an issue that is somewhat blown out of proportion in this election, in part because there are so many Democrats running for the nomination. And one mechanism that has been employed by the party, by the Democratic Party, to limit the number of participants in the debates, and they're having, 10 debates among the Democratic candidates, and you can't have 20 people in a debate. So in order to make the numbers shrink, they required them as one of the metrics to hit a number of small donor contributions. And so I wonder, I think a lot of the reason why they're driving these small donors is because they want to, you see people already being eliminated from the debates because they have not gotten enough small donor contributions. And so I guess I just wonder if it's not an artifact of this particular election and the fact that the Democratic National Committee set this metric for these debates.
I do think that small donor phenomenon is mostly a healthy thing. But this is what really, these are the militants. These are the people who are real activists. And they will be driving much of the debate. But they are highly educated. And they tend to be older. They are not the same race as the rest of the rank and file. They tend to be more white. So I remember Vincent telling me about going to a socialist meeting, local socialist meeting, older, educated, white. These are the people who are mostly giving money. Maybe there's more women than usual. Actually, that's one big thing. Women have achieved parity in giving money. But they're very progressive on social values. They want redistribution, but they don't seek structural reforms that labor, for instance, a major constituency would want. because they're professionals. They're in the service industry, educated industry. They're not really for structural reforms that others in the party. Warren, we'll see how long, she's doing well among small donors, which is a good sign. The way to offset this is public funds. The U.S., you ask American voters, what do you think about providing public funds to the parties and they think it's welfare for politicians. They don't, and especially if you put in the phrase, what do you think of taxpayer-funded public funding for these elections? No way. It's so unpopular. But that's one way. The other way is to think more clearly about institutions that mediate for most Americans, and that's labor unions, for instance, strengthen labor unions to help them get more involved in the fundraising. They're trying to keep up with corporations by spending in these big super PACs. They're not going to win that race.
But at the same time, I like the idea of public funding. One person whom we invited, and I would have loved to be here tonight to enter this conversation, is Juliette Cagé. Some of you here might be familiar with her book, which is an absolutely wonderful piece on two levels. First of all, it's probably the very best essay on the system of financing of French politics, which comes with a lot of comparative aspects. The second fantastic asset of this book by Juliette Cagé is that she made all of her research and data available on a website. So not only can you read her conclusions, but you can go back to the data and say, hey, I like or I don't like the way she interprets that data, or I don't like the way she constructed it. And in her conclusions, Julia, who's a colleague at Sciences Po Paris and an economist by training, advocates public vouchers, a system whereby instead of giving tax breaks to individuals who donate money to the campaigns, you would have vouchers that would be given to every individual regarding of his or her tax status, and vouchers that those individuals could use in any way they please. It's very attractive, and yet at the same time, do you think it would work? And also, we've had this conversation many times, Ray and I, about what we would love to see. We would love to see a reform of the Electoral College. We would love to see a reform of the financing of parties. We would love to see public funding. But I am sometimes more pessimistic than Ray, which is saying something. And I say, no, we'll never see a reform of the Electoral College. Because, and this is something that a point that I would like to raise is that this class of small donors, who are often professionals, highly educated, as you described, has very little appetite for structural reforms. They might be progressive on a lot of issues, but who is going to invest time, energy, and possibly money into a campaign or building a coalition to arrive at a reform of the Electoral College, or other, structural reforms like strengthening political parties, and we'll get back to the theme at a later point in the conversation, or strengthening labor unions. How do you strengthen labor unions, and how do you do that while at the same time abiding by that dicta or that imperative from the Supreme Court that anyway, money is speech, so you can't regulate even if you're trying to strengthen political parties or institutions.
Well, I guess I have to be the optimist because somebody has to be an optimist here. And since I'm not an academic, as much as I'm active in politics, I'd be super depressed if everything I did in my life felt like it was futile. So I have to have some optimism that the fights that I'm engaged in can be successful. So a couple of points. One is that in Seattle, they've actually instituted a voucher program for donations. I think it's very new, so I don't know if anybody can yet analyze, maybe Ray has looked into it, how effective it's been. But it certainly, I think you were earlier alluded, Vincent, to the fact that states and localities have been much more creative in adopting new approaches to the financing of campaigns that get them outside of the understanding of our Supreme Court and the First Amendment.
Can you give us a couple of examples?
Well, the small donor matching system, which again, it may be very unpopular, but it has been adopted in certain places. The Seattle voucher program, but also sort of on the sense of optimism, there is actually a reform for the Electoral College that has had some success, and it's called the National Popular Vote. So this may be a little too esoteric for those of you who haven't spent a lot of time looking at the structure of our Electoral College, but just to say, the Electoral College is an artifact of our Constitution that ensures, that allows that the candidate who has not won the majority of votes can still win the presidency. Because each state gets a certain number of electoral votes, and the winner of that state gets all of them. Even if that winner only got 50.1% of the vote, they still get all of the electoral votes, not 50.1%, but all of them. And so that means that you can have somebody like Donald Trump, like George W. Bush, who did not win the popular vote, and nonetheless wins the Electoral College. So the reform that is suggested, and that has passed in a large number of states, is under a provision of our Constitution called the Compact Clause. States can enter into agreements. And so this policy idea suggests that states pass laws that say, we agree to award our electoral votes to whoever wins the popular vote. And so if enough states agree to award their electoral college votes this way, they could then determine that the popular vote elects the president. We're not there yet, but I think they are about 170 electoral votes towards the 270 that they need. And so it is moving forward. It has continued to pass in additional states. It passed in Colorado fairly recently. And so it may not happen, but it is moving forward. There is activism around it. And the other thing I would just say is that I also may disagree a little bit that certainly activists are interested in structural reform. The first piece of legislation that was introduced in Congress by Nancy Pelosi is all about structural reform. It addresses money in politics, and it addresses electoral reform, including establishing systems to protect the right to vote. So to prevent the voter suppression that has been engaged in so aggressively by the right. And so in part because there has been a lot more activism around structural reforms because of Donald Trump, there was a lot of pressure on the Democratic leaders to the first thing they did was to address structural reform. And every single Democratic candidate running for president has embraced those structural reforms.
So I'm going to play the role of the realist, skeptic, or not, I don't want to say the cynic, but, you know, let me start by saying one of the great structural features of the United States is its federalism, because that allows some resiliency in the system because you can experiment at the state and local level. So we have these experiments like vouchers, and we could study them to see how they work. And vouchers are, it's in the city of Seattle. Most of these reforms, by the way, happen in lefty cities like Cambridge and Seattle. But it's working. It's making it a little bit more diverse. But there is two things. First of all, because these reforms always say you can limit spending, big money just spends money anyway. despite what these vouchers do. They just come in there and just throw money into the race. The second thing is, it's a paradox that when we open up democracy more, the people who are already participating participate more. And it almost increases the distance between the people, between the classes and between the groups, because perfect example is Seattle. People who are already giving money participated the most in the voucher system. People are already doing that. And the groups that were already very powerful, including labor unions, but real estate interests, they mobilized. And so there are cognitive costs associated with all these reforms, and most voters don't, they don't have time to figure out these schemes all the time. That's why we need institutions to kind of mobilize, to absorb those costs of information. And when we do reforms, we don't think about those intermediaries. We just assume, at least in the United States, like, oh, if we give out these vouchers, people are going to be like, oh, I got free money, I could. That's not the way it works. There's institutions between those voters and the politicians that organize it and make things happen. And those institutions have not changed. Those organizations have been around, and they have very strong incentives, narrowly based interests to exploit the system.
So, I mean, it's a good way of transitioning to something which is very important. Would you go along with me and play for 2 minutes the role of the cardiologist of the Republican Party and the cardiologist of the Democratic Party? And it's like, if you put yourself in that role, put on a white robe, and get on your instruments, it looks like the Republican Party, the patient is critical, and has a very, very severe case of Trumpitis, and basically has all the pulse that's left is Trumpism, and is ready to basically let the party die because it is incapable of saying no. And the pulse is slightly stronger on the Democratic side, but you can see all those tensions. And I would like you both to address more because it is the theme of tonight's panel, the way that the changes in the regulation of money in politics have impacted the functioning and also the platforms of those two parties.
Okay. Well, the GOP is certainly in a precarious situation, but parties fight back when they lose quite a bit. The problem for the GOP is they are in thrall to these very narrow groups, and including the Tea Party. So they're not, and Trump is basically delivering for them in many respects. So they've made a deal with the devil to do that. Demographically, they're dying out, literally dying out. The people who support them are much older. They're white Americans, grew up in other generations. And so if they want to survive, they have to appeal to more broadly to Latinos in the United States. That's the group they're hoping for. George W. Bush, was making a bid for them, and Trump blew that up with his attacks on Latinos. And I saw this happen when I was living in California, when there was a governor who supported an initiative that was very nasty towards immigrants. The Republican Party does not exist anymore. They have no power in California since that point. So that could happen to the Republicans at the national level, although they're a little bit more resilient. They really have to. I mean, it's going to take a huge loss. And if Trump, one thing I would say though, because they're dying out, one of the reasons Caroline mentioned voter suppression. This happens to all parties that are dying out. They start to behave in ways that are unconstitutional, that are doing things to like suppress the vote, or change the rules of the game. And that's exactly what the Republican Party is trying to do. And I'm not saying this is a partisan. This is what we all observe as political scientists when you go through all the things they've been trying to do. It replicates what we've seen in other countries.
Thanks, Ray. And, just to add to that, I mean, one of the things I think is important to understand, though, is that there has been a thread in the Republican Party around that has been focused on voter suppression and on narrowing the electorate for a long time. It has a long history of efforts to limit access to voting for minorities. Because it's much easier to get elected if you have only the people who support you who are allowed to vote than to actually appeal to the broad electorate. And so what Ray's saying is absolutely right in the sense that they're shrinking even more, but this has been a long-term effort. And one of the things that I'd like to point out to people is that Ronald Reagan, who is often now talked about by certain non-Trump Republicans as being this sort of shining light in history. He was so wonderful. He started his campaign for president in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which was the site of an assassination of civil rights workers who were working to register black voters in the South. It was a strong signal to white voters in the South, particularly about his orientation, about his interest in appealing to those white voters, and in certainly signaling anti-civil rights interests. The voter suppression efforts have been gone through the Republican Party since before that time, but there has been a continued effort to activate policies that have made it harder for minorities to vote. George W. Bush had an atrocious approach to voting rights. Many of these things just don't get as much attention as some of the other atrocious things he did, like the war in Iraq. But for those of us who work in civil rights and voting rights, it's very clear. For me, I have to say, again, I'm not a political scientist, but it's hard to understand what the future of the Republican Party is, apart from this kind of voter suppression, white supremacy orientation. They don't seem to have any ideology. They used to be the party of free trade. It used to be the party of big business, of small government, of low taxes, and yet at this moment in time, except for the low taxes part, they seem to have abandoned everything else in favor of Trumpism. And so it's hard to know what comes next. They represent a minority of American people, a shrinking minority, with a very abhorrent ideology, and have abandoned their historical libertarian free market orientation. It's not clear what the engagement on ideas is with the Democrats. Of course, what are the ideas of the Democrats? Well, it's also very hard in some ways because as the Republican Party has shrunk, the Democratic Party represents a wider constituency of very divergent interests. So trying to organize a coalition as opposed to a constituency is much harder. So what is going to be the ideology of that coalition representing ideas, professions, working people, minority interests, environmentalists, and to some extent the high-tech industry and Hollywood, and how do you craft a program for all of those interests? And I think that's again, it gets to some of the issues that we've talked about, and why the Democratic Party is somewhat having an identity crisis, because they can't quite coalesce around an ideology.
Well, there is a theory that's prevalent right now among American political scientists, and that is the Republican Party is the party of ideology, although the Trumpism has kind of thrown a wrench into that, and the Democratic Party is a coalition of interests, which makes it hard for them to do that. I disagree somewhat here. I do think that if you're a conservative Republican, you got some of the biggest things you want. You got your tax cuts, you're making government inept, and you've got Supreme Court really trending in a conservative direction, which means deregulations, which means, so Trump came in with Trumpism, but the institution of the Republican Party has pretty much captured him, as far as I can tell. He doesn't get, anytime he strays too much, they don't like the tariffs, but anytime he strays too much from Republican core ideas, he doesn't get, Mitch McConnell is the leader of the Senate for the Republicans, he tells him it's not going to happen. Because the Republicans, that they still have this set of ideologies that hold them together. So I actually think that Trumpism is more of a layer, it's an electoral strategy to get these voters who've been so turned off, and it worked in the last election. We'll see if it works in the next one.
This makes me feel like asking you the following question. First of all, Dr. Fredrickson or Dr. LaRaja, how do you revive the patients? I mean, obviously the political parties are having some kind of an identity crisis. We don't know whether Trumpism is an ideology or just an electoral speech. And in the U.S., we just have two political parties. I mean, right now, and we'll address this in the later part of our conversation, if you look at the situation in France, the Socialist Party has pretty much vanished from the front stage of French politics. Les Républicains, the Conservative Party, is split all over the place, and there's still a lot of blood on the stage. I mean, we do not have strong political parties either in France right now. We have movements which are having a hard time structuring themselves into real parties. But let's remain on the other side of the Atlantic right now. How do you revive the parties? How do you make them stronger in order for them to mediate, for example, between the federal level and the state level? How do you make parties stronger in order to prioritize a public policy and saying that it is more important to have healthcare reform right now than other forms of policy, and then make the pedagogy of that reform? Because what I see at the present time, and Ray and I have been interested in parties for a long time, is parties that are more being played around than organizing the game. And for lack of strong political parties, there's no articulation between the state and the federal level. There's no prioritizing or hierarchy in public policy. And there's also very little in the way of preparing ahead of time. I mean, I will submit that to you, and then you can just tell me, Vincent, you haven't been to the States enough, and you don't know your game anymore. But I have a feeling that neither one of the two parties has been very interested in trying to bring up a new generation, because even when I see the now 17, this is just 17 Democratic candidates for the nomination, I'm not like, wow. The new generation is very appealing. I mean, so we still have the two old men, the slightly younger lady, and then yeah, but none of the younger people are particularly appealing. They check some of the boxes, but not all of them. So the parties have not been able to prepare for the next generation. They're basically incapable of resisting, in the case of the Republican Party, the assault that Trump is leading on the Constitution and on the political system. Again, what's the medicine?
I have two suggestions. One, and Caroline's going to disagree with me here,
That's good.
Yeah, so I think that they passed these reforms in the early 2000 period that really hurt the parties. They took away this kind of money that they call it soft money. It wasn't supposed to be spent on elections, but I actually think that caused money to flow to all these other groups, and rich people set up their own little parties and held the parties hostage because the parties didn't have full control over their own funds. Now, the way they spent them wasn't great, but if the parties really want to revive themselves, they take some of this money and start building up the local parties, which the Democrats are terrible at this. Obama is an organizer. He didn't do anything for the Democratic Party. He set up his own operation, even when he was president, and he sucked the lifeblood out of the party, and you could easily blame him for losing 1,000 seats in the state legislatures. I mean, there's other reasons. There's a backlash against him as the first black president, but he didn't do much to help these state parties deal with that wave. So that's one thing. Fund the parties better. Channel more money through the parties and encourage them through various means to spend it in ways that bring them closer to citizens. The second thing is reform the primaries. And I hope, I mean, there's a lesson here is that, you know, there's 17 people running the primary. There's actually 50 people or more who you don't even know some of the people who are running, but there's 17 people, 20 people on the stage. That's not you can't make choices with that many people. There's going to be some other vetting process. I think the party professionals need to have more of a role in vetting, screening out some of these candidates. The Republican Party has foisted upon the rest of the world Donald Trump because they had a terrible nomination process. It was chaos. It was a plebiscite that the elites couldn't take control of. One other little thing I would encourage people to think about is gaining popularity in the United States as a reform, again, from the local and states, is ranked choice voting. Trump would not have won the nomination.
Explain, please.
So ranked choice voting is when you sincerely vote, you have a list of candidates, you vote for your favorites from 1 to 5 or 1 to 20. Now, again, there are cognitive costs for the voter. Do I really know anything beyond the third person? But, you know, in theory, you vote for your favorite candidates, and the one who comes in last, if somebody wins a majority first, they're the nominee. If no one does, you take the person who's at the least votes, you take the voters who voted for that person, and you calculate their votes, distribute them to all the other candidates. You keep doing this until you come up with a majority. So you basically end up being able to elect somebody who has a majority of support within the party or within the electorate. And I think this has several features that commend it. One is it forces, you can vote sincerely. If you're a Green Party member, think in 2000, if you're in general election, and in the United States, and you like this guy, Ralph Nader, who's from the Green Party, you can vote sincerely for him and put Al Gore number 2 without taking away votes from Al Gore, who ended up losing, well, we think he lost, some people think he lost, in the election. Because you don't have to vote strategically. You don't have to say, well, if I vote for my favorite Green Party member, I might give it to my worst enemy on the other side. So it deals with that. It also encourages candidates to not use as much negative advertising because you don't want to get the person next to you, their voters, upset. So if Warren and Sanders are fighting each other, they're actually behaving pretty well to each other. But you would not want to upset the voters in the other, because they might come to you next. So it diminishes the negative advertising. So for those three things, the majoritarian impulse, the sincere voting, and I think it's a good reform. They've done it in Maine, the state of Maine. Several cities do it: Cambridge, Berkeley, San Francisco, where I live in Amherst. Notice these are all, like, for those of you who know, they're all lefty towns, university towns for the most part. But
Not Maine.
well, Maine is unusual, and they're going to the courts because there's a fight over this, because the Republican member of Congress did not win when it went to a ranked choice system. So
Just 1 second, and this is a question for both of you. My ideal Democratic Party today would be a party in which somebody would tell Beto O'Rourke, Beto, go home and run for the Senate in Texas again. You might win. you're
They are
better off.
trying. They are trying.
Okay, yeah, but, and tell, like, the third tier of candidates, guys, go back to Congress, to the state legislature, and please let the big girls and big boys get more time on the air and more exposure. It would be a party in which there would be probably better coordination between the leadership, Nancy Pelosi notably, and the political candidates. And where, for example, on the issue of impeachment, you wouldn't have the party all over the place. It's like some getting into impeachment by, with a blind over their eyes and earplugs, and others charging forward like onward Christian soldiers will impeach Donald.
Well, actually, Vincent, I think the Democratic Party is actually not that much in disagreement anymore about impeachment. The numbers in favor of impeachment in the House are actually very strong. The latest evidence of Donald Trump's wrongdoing with regard to Ukraine has transformed much of the way the Democrats in the House have approached the issue, where you have the Democrats who won in 2018 in districts that had been won by Donald Trump. These were the Democrats who've been most reluctant because they're afraid that they would lose re-election because their districts supported Donald Trump in 2016 and that may very well support Donald Trump again in 2020. And so they were very reluctant to support impeachment. That has changed very much in just the last several weeks, where many of these Democrats are actually going into town hall meetings and being forthright with the people who come about why it is that now, with the national security interests that have been raised, I think with Syria now, that probably becomes even more accentuated, because now all of a sudden Republicans are criticizing Donald Trump because of his bizarre decision to allow the Turkey to go in to Syria and overwhelm the former U.S. ally, the Kurds. So I think that has been somewhat transformative. I would say, just to go back to what Ray was saying, I actually agree with you on ranked choice voting. I think it's a really important reform. On the soft money in politics, which is this money going to parties, I don't necessarily have strong feelings about that particular reform, except to say I didn't see the Democratic Party funding state parties, the National Democratic Party doing very much at all to build the party structure when they had soft money. So I guess I'm skeptical that it would make very much difference in that process. Because I'm coming out of the left, generally I've looked at more at how to strengthen the Democratic Party and the progressive movement than spending a lot of time thinking about the Republican Party, because from my perspective, I'm not that interested in seeing them stronger.
But you want a healthy Republican Party.
Yes, I want a healthy and not crazy Republican Party. Yes.
You need to have a healthy
But what I would just say is, so what I've looked at is really more, I think, along the lines of what Vincent was saying about the kind of long-term horizon and leadership development. I have seen a very great discrepancy between the left and the right. In fact, if I can give a very self-interested plug to my recent book, The Democracy Fix, the framework that I look at is the Republican, the right engagement in funding long-term institutions to build power, understanding that the policy issues of healthcare and so forth are really secondary to gaining power. And so looking at how to build systems, in their case, voter suppression and gerrymandering to control elections, how to develop a leadership program for young lawyers to take over the court system, as well as academics to influence the thinking that judges apply. They put a lot of money. I mean, it wasn't necessarily through the party, but it was the funders that are linked with the party, the Koch brothers and others, who for decades have been building institutions to think about how to capture power. On the left, in the Democratic Party, but generally the progressive movement, even outside of the party, has been very focused on issues and not thinking systemically, thinking first about policy, not about power. And I think from my analytical perch, which has been about thinking through sort of the differential between the power of the right and the left in the United States, and one of the reasons why the right has captured so much more of state power, state legislatures and governors, is this investment that they've made. But also now with Donald Trump in the courts, as Ray very rightly brought up, it's been a very powerful effort by Donald Trump and has been very much applauded by the Republican Party. But that has been a decades of project. You don't become a judge overnight. They found the law students and they groomed them through the process, and that has been a very long-term investment. So I think there is one of the reasons why the Democratic Party is so weak is because they have had such a short-term horizon. They have not had leadership development. They have not been building institutions that are intermediaries, that are think tanks, they certainly haven't been caring about the labor movement and thinking about how to strengthen unions. One of the pieces of legislation that Barack Obama could have fought for at the beginning of his term was the Employee Free Choice Act, which was meant to kind of strengthen labor protections and strengthen labor unions. Well, he didn't invest any what we call political capital in that battle at all, to the great disappointment of unions in the United States. So I think, again, there's a big blind spot on the left about long-term thinking and about building institutions and about thinking about power as opposed to policy.
Well, I think Donald Trump, silver lining is he's caused the left to actually start organizing very well, as we saw in the 2018 elections, and those organizations still going on. However, I want to make another point of difference between me and Caroline. I really think you need two healthy parties. The Republican Party is breaking norms, and it's really fundamentally altering American democracy. And so I want to see a healthy Republican Party.
Said my focus has been on the Democratic Party.
So what I'm saying is, some of the things I'm recommending, keeping the money within the party structures, is precisely to have the Republican Party fend off some of these groups funded by quirky billionaires, these crazy billionaires, that compete with them. They send candidates that the Republican Party does not even like. They recruit and run candidates, and I'm talking at the state level, places like Missouri, places like Kansas, and they win these elections in districts which are overwhelmingly Republican voters by pluralities, and then they send this person to Congress. And then you wonder why nothing gets done in Congress. You have these Tea Party groups. That's fundamentally why I want to strengthen the Republican Party as an institution relative to these other groups that are now pushing hard to the right. The effect, obviously, is if the Democratic Party did the same thing, they might get things done, but it might be a more moderate party. So if you're coming from the left, I need to point that out. What I'm suggesting is a moderating of the two-party system. And if you're a progressive, I'm saying, all right, you want to go for it, all these other structures outside the party, but guess who's doing it twice as fast as you? The Republicans.
So to continue our disagreement, I guess where I come as a skeptic on this idea is that it's unclear to me how you control the Koch brothers, or you prevent the Koch brothers from controlling the party structure in any case. How is it that you prevent those big money? Maybe you think of them as less extreme than the Tea Party, who's running these candidates at the local level. But what is the mechanism in which you ensure that you have this kind of wise people in the parties deciding how to control local parties and how to ensure that the candidates are within some kind of appropriate spectrum? I'm not really sure how that happens. I don't know what the legal mechanism is for that, for sure, certainly within our First Amendment confines. And so that, for me, it seems like a nice theoretical idea, that we could have kind of the wise, used to be called the wise men, but we know that didn't work out so well. So maybe the wise people what would be that structure? And it's just not apparent to me.
Well, the wise people are out there, and they've waited too long, and I'm sorry for that. But I'd like to hear questions from the audience.
Okay. Well, I could ask a million questions, but I'll limit myself to two, and I'll go quickly, if that's okay. So my first question, going back to the issue of the dark money and the politics, you know, I'm still trying to understand, maybe from a historical perspective, how did we get here? Because, like you said, the common refrain is that everything exploded with Citizens United. But from what I understand, there was a precedent to this. And where does this reading from the Supreme Court of this absolutism and free speech, where does that come from? Is this something that's natural, it's normal to interpret things this way, or was there a historical process in play? Then my second question, just quickly, is on the issue of the future of the Republican Party, how it needs to adapt to demographics. And maybe I say this from a point of as a concerned citizen as well. I remember in 2012, there was that post-mortem on the Republican Party after the election saying that basically we have to adapt to the demographics or the party dies out. And then now, I'm skeptical of that reading because Donald Trump came in and sort of blew that whole that analysis up by doing exactly the opposite of what the Republican Party was supposedly supposed to do to adapt and stay in power.
Well,
so I just wanted to get your reading on that.
Maybe I'll take the first one and.
Well, I think we should have a few questions and then answer them as a block.
Thank you very much to both of you for a great dialogue and presentations. I have two very short questions. Could you tell us more about the Red Map project of the Republicans? Is that going anywhere? Is that really going to be transformative for the next redistricting after the census? And my second question is, what happened to the Howard Dean's 50-state strategy of the Democratic Party? Is that still somewhere, or is this still the whole territory of the U.S. a concern for the Democrats, or totally dead? Thank you.
Okay, let me see if I can focus here. I guess my question has to do with what the two of you were saying, Ray and Vincent, about the apparent incapacity of the Democratic Party to renew itself and to get young blood and young energy. And what I'm seeing from where I sit, I don't claim to have any special knowledge here, but I'm just a spectator and a voter living abroad. But I do see energy and renewal through the emerging left, and I'm not just talking, out of my hat here. There are at least some strong indications that outside of Biden, you have two candidates who lean left and who may be commanding as much as 45% of the primary vote, and then you have this young delegation of new people in the House, including lots of young women, a few women of color, some of whom are very vociferous and apparently pretty good organizers too. I'm not thinking just of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but also of her whole squad. I wish I had a badge that said I'm with the squad, because I am. Aren't they doing something? You see, obviously, things from a more organizational point of view, and you also see where the money goes, and that's important. But I'm wondering whether this influx of new people, younger people, plus small donors is not the sign that maybe they're gaining some energy that they didn't have before, that they weren't able to mobilize in 2016.
Well, that's a lot of great questions. It's hard to know where to start. Except since I was being self-promotional before, I'll be self-promotional again and say I have a book coming out in January called The AOC Way. It's about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her impact on organizing. In part, she's so interesting because she goes exactly to what you were talking about engaging the young electorate. And she is a member of her squad, but not just beyond that. This class of 2018 in the House, the newly elected members in the House of Representatives are far more diverse and younger and more female than ever in history. And when you look at the Republicans in the House compared to the Democrats in the House, you're going to see a bunch of old white guys, who are frowning. And then this cohort of younger, more brown and black, and women in the Democratic Party, which, from my perspective, again, I come from the left, I think is just tremendously exciting. And so I, had a lot of fun doing research on her life and sort of how she did her politics, and sort of what her leadership means. And I certainly hope that, that she, whatever people agree or disagree with her political politics, her particular politics are, but that she has a deep organizing background and that she understands that, politics is also about organizing people. It's not just about the policy side. A quick, just to speak to the kind of legal framework and the history. So you're right to say that there were previous decisions. Buckley versus Vallejo is the significant decision that really allowed for Citizens United to happen later. And that's the decision in which the post-Watergate reforms of our campaign finance structure were limited by the Supreme Court. And what they said in that case was that giving money is an expressive activity. So therefore, it is protected by the First Amendment's free speech provisions. Now, for me, I think personally that doesn't mean that it should be absolute, because we restrict a lot of speech. And certainly, you could say giving money is expressive, but why isn't voting expressive? Voting is not protected under our First Amendment, and yet, isn't voting more expressive as your political opinions than giving somebody a check, especially because many donors give the same amount of money to all the candidates. And so, so anyway, so that's where it comes from. It was the product, again, of this right-wing investment in sort of infrastructure, which included think tanks and scholars who have developed a very libertarian approach to corporate speech, to the role of financial interests in the promotion of certain ideas that should be allowed to flourish without any restrictions on the basis of speech. The Koch brothers were also part of that, flourishing the right kind of infrastructure of think tanks and legal scholars has really pushed that forward. They had a number of different stages that they moved it through, and we are now pretty much in a totally libertarian situation where there are almost no controls on money in politics, and we'll wait to see what happens in the coming Supreme Court decisions. But they have dismantled protections against corruption by government officials. They say that if it's not a direct bribe, then it's okay, because it's not corruption. The only corruption they understand that can be controlled is a direct bribe. So I could speak a little bit about RedMap, but I know about it more from the 2010 perspective. But all I would just say is that it's been, I think, a good development that the Democrats are actually now focused on the redistricting process. A lot of their investment is in ensuring that there will be a nonpartisan redistricting process, as opposed to what I think the Republicans are focused on, which is capturing state houses to really gerrymander them even further than they are.
I'll be quick. What happened in 2012 with the Republicans? Well, in 2016, they thought somebody would carry that mantle. Jeb Bush, he didn't get any traction whatsoever. Trump was speaking to a constituency that has been ignored by the Republican Party. White men, working class white men, especially the anxieties of rural America. He totally, and it was a faction. This is why I want ranked choice voting. It was a faction of the Republican Party. It wasn't the entire Republican Party. And he took that, and then he benefited in the general election from a pretty robust, the difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party is they do a better job building organizations in the Republican Party. Trump just slipped right into that. He didn't raise much money at all. I mean, he raised small donors, but he didn't have any infrastructure, so he benefited from that. In terms of new energy, there's a lot of groups that sprang up in 2018. I can go tick through a list, but they had preferences for all these different types of candidates. Some were military veterans, some were progressives, and They basically fed these people. They're going to be coming up through state legislatures. So this is a back and forth thing for the two parties. When they lose badly, they really go out and have their constituencies recruit. So I'm actually pretty optimistic about the Democratic Party. The Republicans are the one who are more in trouble in terms of that.
Okay, so we'll take one more question, then I have a 2-minute game for our guests, and then we'll call it a night.
To get back to the question of money in politics and to fantasize from an optimist standpoint, what do you think of my silver bullet scenario that could really do a lot to solve a lot of these problems that you've been discussing today? Namely, a blue sweep in the 2020 election. Democrats pack the Supreme Court. You know, we say, look, you guys, Republicans, you violated the Constitution when you wouldn't consider Merrick Garland. So we're going to put 2 people on the Supreme Court. So that creates a progressive majority on the Supreme Court. And then one of the first decisions the Supreme Court does is it knocks down Buckley versus Vallejo, which was that 1976 decision that opened the way to equating money and speech. So if you knock down Buckley versus Vallejo, then you can reconstruct the entire campaign finance regime from the ground up and actually create a system that might work. I mean, is that so far-fetched, and is that a potential silver bullet solution?
Can I have some of what you're having, Jean?
So that is extremely hopeful, of course, getting a blue sweep. You know, one thing I'm reluctant, when people talk about packing the Supreme Court, there's currently 9 justices and putting more. To me, that's the exact type of constitutional hardball that the Republicans engage in. And so you're setting a precedent for you know, there's nothing in the Constitution that says you can't do that, but I just think that it plays into a game of we're going to change the traditions, the rules, whenever we get into power. And that creates instability, I think.
Well, I can't, I have to agree with the questioner, who happens to be my husband. But I would anyway. And in part, I guess, I think that so many of the rules have been broken by the Republicans already, that at this point, if Democrats and the left don't play some hardball, then we're out of luck. And I think the Supreme Court is the one place where it's really important to think about that hard, because the rules that they lay down are for forever. You can't change a constitutional ruling through Congress. The only way you could do it is by amending the Constitution, which is a nearly impossible task. And so to the extent that they broke the rules by refusing to give Merrick Garland a hearing or a vote, which had never happened before since the time when the Senate started having hearings for Supreme Court justices, they broke the rules. And it was devastating. And as a result, I think, again, I'm not going to say I'm 100% for it, but I don't think that it is outrageous. I would also say that the Supreme Court has changed sizes quite a bit over our history. Maybe not that much recently, but in the 19th century, it changed quite a bit at different times. So I think there's a lot at stake here. The Supreme Court is a linchpin in all of these things in terms of whether or not our campaigns are actually going to allow for the majority of voters to have their voices heard. I'm deeply worried about the situation that we're in, and so I think it should be open to consideration.
All right, now time for the game. Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, or the X Factor?
Are you asking me who I want to win?
No.
Or who will win?
Who will?
Okay, well,
Because this,
I will state just for the record that I represent an organization that is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, and so therefore I must say that anything I say here is in my personal capacity and does not reflect the position of my organization. Elizabeth Warren. I like Joe. I mean, I worked in the Senate when Joe Biden was a senator. I sort of have a certain amount of affection for him, and yet I don't see it. I see him weakening anyway already versus Elizabeth Warren. I happen to think very highly of her, but I also think she is capturing the electorate in a way that he's not. He's fading, and I think he continues to show some weak points that come out, and that I think as the debates go on, will continue to come out and be seen even in a more exaggerated way as he is up against a smaller pool of debaters?
Well, what I notice is that, I mean, Warren's an excellent campaigner. She's a real she's great for us professors. I mean, she's perfect. But what I notice is that in places like New Hampshire and Iowa, very unrepresentative of the rest of the country. If you look outside those states, this guy Biden is still doing very well. There's a lot of goodwill towards him. I'm looking at two things. I'm looking at, for instance, what are their numbers in the Midwest? So don't look at the national polls. Look at those key states where Hillary Clinton lost. You know, Wisconsin, Michigan, places like that. And then I'm looking to see who's got the support of African Americans, because that is a major constituency, and they have to turn out for this election in the cities and especially in the Midwest. And I mean, Warren's well positioned to take this, believe me, especially because Bernie Sanders had his heart attack. But she hasn't captured those constituencies yet, so I'm waiting to see that.
So Warren and or Joe versus Trump.
If I have to say right now, I think he would cause, Joe Biden would cause, my concern is not so much, I said Democratic turnout, my concern is Republican turnout, and I'm speaking now as a partisan. I think Joe Biden would reduce GOP turnout. I think Elizabeth Warren will increase GOP turnout. So take that into consideration.
I think Elizabeth Warren will increase Democratic turnout because there'll be a lot more excitement around her candidacy than Joe Biden, who will, a lot of the young voters who've been engaged in the 2018 election, I think may find that a little bit depressing.
Thank you on those kind words. Thank you very much.